Hello, this is Grandmaster Daniel King with a video recap of Tata Steel Round 5. Now, the first game I'd like to look at is Sergei Karyakin against Adiban Baskaran. Now, on paper, this seems like a bit of a mismatch. Karyakin, World Championship challenger, playing against Adiban, who, well, a strong Grandmaster. He won the Challengers tournament last year in Vaikanze, but he's really at the bottom of this tournament. So Karyakin would be looking to try to win this game. Now, e4, e6, this was already a bit of a surprise because Adiban has never played the French before. Incredible. Let's see what happens. Now, he could anticipate Karyakin playing knight c3. He's a creature of habit. And Adiban has played the classical. That's a variation I like very much. I always feel that, as an opening, you get pretty decent counter chances for black on the queen side. Of course, you have to suffer a little bit of white's extra space with this pawn on e5. But still, what do you want from an opening? You've got a solid pawn center, and you've got chances to counter-attack on the queen side. Well, that seems like a bit of a bargain to me. So, bishop e7. Now, this is quite a trendy way to play. Of course, one can play in many different ways in this position. There's a6. There's you can take on d4 as well. That's also possible. But bishop e7 is currently very popular. The idea is just to castle kingside very quickly and then see what happens on the queen side. So a6, preparing perhaps to advance with b5, standard counterattack. Now a3 from Karyakin. Now this looks a little bit unusual. In fact, it's quite a typical move for these kind of positions. Very often, white wants to exchange on c5 and then play b4. In fact, Karyakin had this position before, and instead of a3, he took on c5. This was against Nakamura from Beijing in 2012. But in this position, it didn't work out very well at all. Nakamura got in f6 very, very quickly and started a very dangerous counterattack on the queen side, and Nakamura won a very nice game. So let's just go back. Today, Karyakin wanted to do something different, and that was a3. And in fact, he's copying his compatriot Vladimir Kramnik, who won a very nice game in the Olympiad against Georg Mayer. Karyakin would have seen that game at close hand. So let's see how things developed. Castle's kingside. Now Karyakin took on c5 and played queen f2. So obviously hitting the knight on c5. And here, I mentioned this game Kramnik against Mayer from the Baku Olympiad. In that game, Mayer played b6. Kramnik answered with b4. And, well, this was a really wild game. Kramnik won an incredible game, very sacrificial game. You can see the point of a3 now to play this pawn move b4. This pawn on b4 actually controls this c5 square, which really cramps black's pieces. So let's just go back to the game. Instead of b6, Adiban very quickly played knight d7. Now this is a novelty, and he said afterwards that he'd been studying this on the free day yesterday. That was when he decided to play the French. Incredible. So he learned a whole opening in 24 hours. Not bad at all. So why come back to d7? This looks very strange, going back and forth, knight c5, and then going back to d7. Very odd indeed. The idea is he's preparing a very quick f6, and this makes a lot of sense when the queen is opposite the rook on f8. Sorry, there's a lot of color on the board. Let me try and remove that. So, for example, in this position, if white tried the same as Kramnik with b4, then f6 could be very embarrassing for white after something like this. So that diagonal is ripped open, and there's latent pressure on the f-file as well. So that's not so clever. Even bishop d3 would be met by f6, and well, in this case, knight takes with the idea knight g4, winning a knight for a bishop, or a bishop for a knight, depending on how you look at it. And if h3, then knight h5, targeting this pawn and perhaps looking at pinning on the f-file. So this is the clever idea of knight d7. Looks strange. But knight d4 from white, and this is a very logical move, blockading on d4 and of course preventing f6. So in order to get in f6, black has to exchange. Well, the bishop looks pretty nice on d4, and then comes f6. So this has to be traded. Adiban moving instantly, whereas Karyakin was having to pause and think over his moves. So pressure on Karyakin already. Here, logical move is to castle queenside. But then Adiban thought e5, now bishop c5. He said this was a line that he'd looked at. And in this position, bishop c4. Now, white recaptures the pawn. You can capture it, well, really anyhow you like. Bishop, knight, whatever. And white's pieces are well centralized. They look quite imposing, but one feels with this bishop, black is probably okay in that position. Okay, let's go back. But instead of castles queenside, Karyakin took on f6. Slightly strange decision, because that does bring the queen into play. There's threat to take on f4. Now, a bold move. g5, exploiting the pin on the f-file. But of course, a risky move when the king becomes exposed. Nothing to do but castle queenside here, giving a pawn. Now, white, of course, does have compensation because black's queenside pieces are rather, well, badly developed. The question is how best to get compensation. Well, here, probably rook d4 is the best idea. And this is not so clear. Maybe in this position, Adiban thought that maybe queen g3 check, but it might be even better to move the queen to the side. I mean, if black takes here, then opening the h-file could be very nasty for the king. And white would like to recapture on g3 with the pawn and swing this one over to the h-file. Now, this is not so clear, not clear at all. But instead, Karyakin just played king b1, but Adiban seized his chance. f3 is a very good move because to some extent it closes the king side, but also, you know, that is a strong passed pawn on f3. Queens are not the best blockaders. So by this stage, things, well, starting to look pretty good for black. That's a nice move, knight e5. Karyakin is trying to open the king side. I mean, maybe his best move is h4 here. He doesn't need to panic just yet. Black stands better. But instead he played g6. Now this is a bit desperate. That was played after about 10 minutes thought. But that just got taken. Actually, you know, white hasn't got that much for the pawn, or two pawns in this position. And Adiban simply started connecting his pieces. Now rook g1, well, that's a very optimistic move. Moving this rook to g1 obviously he's hoping to get both rooks into the game, advancing the h-pawn as well, but it does leave the other side of the board a little bit lacking in protection. I mean, possibly moving the h-rook to g1 would have been better, but, well, now things started to go very well indeed for black. So he's now developed. White doesn't dare move the queen. Rook g1 threatening rook g6, but that's easily defended. Looks a bit passive at the moment, but well, we see on so many occasions that that light squared bishop in the French actually is very strong. Rook h5, well, this was perhaps not the best move, slightly inaccurate, but doesn't really make a huge difference to the position. Now Adiban found the right idea, looking at e2, and after knight e3, bishop b5. This is a strong move. If rook g6, then bishop d3, check, and then you take the rook. So back we go. So that pawn needs defending, and it's not easy to defend that pawn. For example, if king c2, then rook c8 check, and now this is a winning move. For example, queen takes, queen check. Or if we go back just a moment, then king takes, queen e5 check, then queen b2, and well, but this is absolutely terrible. We're going to get there in the end. Here we go, and now, for example, bishop d3. Black is just completely winning. Well, what else have we got? In the game, white played rook d4. Now rook e4 was the move planned. Now in this position, the best move is just to take this, but in fact, after this move, king f7 is very strong. Not king h7, suddenly the tables are turned after this unpleasant move, and then followed by a discovered check. But if we just go back, then king f7 is actually very safe. And let's say rook here, then pawn takes. Black is 2 pawns up and starting to simplify, and this bishop is, well, rock solid, rock solid. Let's go back. I mean, that's white's best. But in the game, rook g6 happened, not the best move. After bishop d3 check, Karyakin resigned. If rook takes bishop, then queen takes rook. Black is the exchange up and has a completely winning position. So a really convincing victory by Adiban, and Karyakin just looked really wrong-footed there. Yeah, where was his legendary opening preparation that we might have expected after the World Championship match? Afraid we didn't see it in evidence today. Big game of the round was Wesley So with white against Pentala Hari Krishna. Both, I mean, pretty solid players. Wesley on fantastic form at the moment. 2016 was a very good year for him, just coming off victory in the London Chess Classic, and before that, excellent result in the Sinkfield in Baku, superb score for the American team, and before that, he won in the Sinkfield Cup. So he's really the man in form. Here he said he didn't really expect d5. He said Hari Krishna hasn't played this before, but it looked as though Wesley was somehow more clued up about this opening. This is a very important move, queen a4 check, because if white doesn't play that, for example, just castles, black castles, then very often black has the chance to sack a pawn with knight c6 and get pretty good compensation against pawn on b2 and opening up this diagonal as well. So let's just go back. But queen a4 is a rather upsetting move because knight c6 isn't possible here. That just loses material after takes, and the queen comes down c6. Otherwise, bishop d7 doesn't look too good after, yeah, simply queen c4, and there's already a threat here. This is better for white. So basically, in this position, black has to compromise knight d7, which rather blocks in black's pieces. And after this, well, it's clear that white is for choice here. So there's pressure on the d file as well. It's just a much more comfortable position for white to play than black. Queen comes back to a3. It's actually a pretty good square for the queen, looking at e7. And don't forget, there's a potential discovered attack here. Queen d6. Well, this gets out of a few difficulties. Black is still a pawn up after all, but white's pieces are so well placed here. The players are actually following a previous game between Kramnik and Nepomniachtchi that was played in Dortmund in 2015. And that game, well, they're following it exactly. And here, Nepomniachtchi played knight e8 to defend the pawn on d6, then rook c1, a5, and Kramnik won back the pawn with a positional advantage. And Kramnik ended up winning a very, very accomplished technical game. So let's go back. Well, it seems that Hare Krishna wasn't really familiar with this. Wesley said after the game that he had this game in mind. I mean, a couple of moves before, actually, Hare Krishna thought for half an hour over a6. So it's clear that he was feeling very, very uncomfortable in this position. He played d5. And now a5, knocking the knight back. So, I mean, this in itself is very pleasant to cramp black's queenside pawns. But, of course, here it's possible to take back a pawn straight away. But Wesley was really cool. He basically just wanted to maintain his activity and just played rook c1 here. I mean, you could do this, but the problem is it actually frees black's pieces to some extent. So, for example, here, yes, white is a pawn up, but black does have some kind of activity with this bishops, and Wesley thought this pawn wouldn't be so easy to realize. So let's go back. So instead of all that, Wesley just played rook c1. I think a very good practical decision, actually. Just keep black's pieces bottled up, and white's pieces. Well, what a picture! What harmony there is in white's position. It's very attractive. But I think this move, rook c1, also shows enormous confidence that, yeah, don't need to recapture the pawn immediately. Okay, let's see how things developed. Rook d8, bishop c7, so not an easy position at all. And here, well, maybe knight f8 was a slightly better move, but white, in that case, would take the pawn back with probably another to come. But he certainly gained on that other variation. Knight e5 happened. And now, interesting, you could play knight takes d5, but instead Wesley played a move which first seems rather counterintuitive, to give up his bishop for the knight. But this knight looks at so many juicy squares in black's camp. It's very tempting to play like this. So let's see, bishop g4. Now things got very, very complicated. And all the time, Hare Krishna really running short of time already. one of the points behind bishop g4 is that after the obvious move f3, then suddenly all hell breaks loose after knight d3, opening up the bishop's diagonal, hitting the rook on c1. I mean, so many pieces are on prece here, but this is probably going to work out in black's favour, or at least, you know, he's not worse, let's say. So Wesley had to be rather careful here. Same applies after knight c7. Knight d3 is possible in that position as well. I mean, it's an absolutely crazy position. Just so many pieces can be taken. And don't forget a rook up here as well. But Wesley kind of recognised the danger, and after 7.5 minutes played rook d2. So just trying to keep a lid on the tactics. Tricky position, rook d8. Knight b6, so this rook, well, it certainly doesn't want to move to a7. So Hare Krishna gave that one up. Black has two bishops. The knight is to some extent stuck on a8, but it can't be won. This knight is always going to come back into the game somehow. And white is able to hold the material. But they get to a situation where now pawns are being exchanged, and black does have the two bishops, but the thing is, white can never lose this position. So this is a joy for white to play, and particularly when Hare Krishna was in desperate time pressure. And here, next move of black's not so good, knight b4. That even feels a very wobbly move, trying to sort of hold everything together, but the knight on b4 doesn't look stable, doesn't look like a good move. Let's just go back a second. Instead of knight b4, Wesley thought maybe bishop f5 would be the best chance, but I don't know, in practical terms, I think this would still be a very difficult endgame to hold. You know, he talked about this position with perhaps some drawing chances. But if we just go back a couple of moves, I mean, white doesn't have to play knight b3. I mean, maybe something like knight f3, or even knight f1 coming round to e3. I feel that the writing is on the wall for black here. White should win. Okay, let's go back. But in the game, sorry, let's go right back here. In the game, knight b4 played, but Wesley managed to wrap things up very quickly with this move, and this simplifies. That's a nasty move to have to meet. The tactics now are in white's favour. Obviously, sorry, let me just go back a move. You can see something nasty is happening on the d file. So this simplification happened, and this is a terribly simple endgame to win. White just needs to centralise. As long as white keeps control here, then it's actually very, very easy. Black is never going to be able to use the a pawn, and ultimately black's kingside pawns are actually very vulnerable, particularly after f4, just fixing them. And here, well, there's not too much play in the game, and that wins that pawn, and white is in complete control. So a very convincing victory by Wesley So, and that brings him up to 4 out of 5 in the tournament. He leads the tournament just behind Carlsen and Ulyanov with 3.5. Ulyanov was outplayed by Aronian today very nicely. A heavyweight struggle, but Aronian really played superbly with black. Then Aronian has 3 out of 5, and then a pack on 50%, Andreikin, Wojtaszek, Giri, Karyakin, and Hare Krishna. Giri drew his 5th game today. Had a good position against Wei Yi, but that was finally a draw. Then moving further down, we have Nepomniachtchi with 2 and Aliban with 2. Nepomniachtchi against Carlsen was a draw. Carlsen played very accurately to draw that game. Wojciech defeated Van Velde. Van Velde is at the bottom of the tournament with half, and Andrakin and Rapport drew. Rapport has 1.5. So going into round 6, the leader, Wesley So, plays black against Adiban. That might be a good chance for him to try and extend his lead. But one shouldn't underestimate Adiban, as we saw today. And then Carlsen has black against Aronian. Elyanov has white against Karyakin. It's going to be very tight, but Wesley So looking good at the moment. Out on his own, half a point lead with a 4 out of 5.